A 23-year-old mechanic kneels in frozen mud. His name is Unteroffizier Karl Fuchs. He serves with the 7th Panzer Division I of Germany's most celebrated armored formations. His hands are black to the wrists with engine grease and the early discoloration of frostbite. His fingernails are cracked from prying at engine bolts in temperatures no German soldier was issued gloves for. Around him, the steppe is flat, featureless, and endless in every direction. 3 days ago, his regiment had 42 tanks running. This morning it was 9. Not from Soviet shells. From the cold. From a distance. From a country that refused to end. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest military invasion in the history of the world. 3 million soldiers crossed the Soviet border on a front nearly 1,800 miles wide. They brought 3,400 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, and an assumption. The assumption was simple. The Soviet Union would collapse in 8 weeks. Hitler told his generals the Red Army was a rotten structure. Kick in the door, he said, and the whole thing would come crashing down. It would not collapse in 8 weeks. It would not collapse in 80. And the men who believed the promise would pay for it with everything they had. Karl Fuchs would pay with his life. He just did not know it yet. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. The invasion front stretched from the Baltic coast in the north to the Black Sea in the south. 3 army groups struck simultaneously at dawn without a declaration of war. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb. Army Group Center aimed for Moscow under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. Army Group South pushed into Ukraine under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. On paper, it was the most powerful military force ever assembled in a single campaign. 3.8 million Axis troops in total, including Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian contingents. 17 panzer divisions formed into 4 panzer groups at the tip of the spear. 3,400 tanks ready to drive east. 2,700 aircraft ready to sweep the skies. 600,000 motor vehicles to carry fuel and ammunition forward. And 600,000 horses. Horses, that detail mattered more than anyone admitted at the time. Only 20% of the German army was mechanized. Only 33 divisions out of 130 had engines to move them. The remaining 3/4 moved by foot and by animal, just as armies had done for centuries. 80% of Wehrmacht logistics depended on horse-drawn wagons. Goebbels told his photographers and newsreel cameramen to film the tanks, not the horses. The propaganda showed a modern war machine, all steel and speed and mechanical fury. The reality was a 19th century army with a 20th century spearhead. And that spearhead was thinner than anyone outside the general staff understood. German tank strength had been deliberately halved in 1940, so the number of panzer divisions could be doubled. The appearance of strength mattered more than the substance of it. Over half the tanks committed to Barbarossa were obsolescent light tanks and Czech-built models, not the more capable Panzer IIIs and 4Fs that the newsreels featured. And there were virtually no reserves waiting behind the front. 148 divisions, 80% of the entire German army, were committed to the eastern invasion. If those divisions broke, there was nothing behind them. No second wave, no strategic reserve, nothing. The entire plan depended on a single premise. Destroy the Red Army before winter. Knock the Soviet state out in one devastating blow before the snow and cold arrive. Because Germany did not have the industrial base to fight a long war against a continental power. Its oil came overwhelmingly from Romania. The Ploesti field supplied over 50% of German crude imports. Its synthetic fuel plants filled part of the gap, but nowhere near enough for a sustained campaign across the vastness of Russia. If Barbarossa stalled, if the war dragged past December, Germany would face the one thing it could not survive: a war of attrition against an enemy with more men, more material, more factories, and more space to trade for time. Karl Fuchs had written to his wife in July with absolute confidence. "The Russians are finished," he told her. By August, he stopped writing about victory. He started writing about mud. The first 9 days of the invasion killed 25,000 German soldiers. That number stunned the German high command. The entire Western campaign of 1940, the conquest of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, had cost 30,000 dead in 6 weeks. Russia matched that toll in 9 days. July was worse. 63,000 German soldiers died in a single month. It was the deadliest single month for the Wehrmacht until the catastrophe at Stalingrad a year and a half later. Tens of thousands more were wounded. The medical system, designed and supplied for a short campaign, was overwhelmed before the summer ended. But the victories looked staggering. At Minsk, the Wehrmacht encircled 300,000 Soviet troops in the first week. At Smolensk, another 300,000 in July. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched west in columns that stretched for miles along roads the Germans themselves could barely use. The Luftwaffe destroyed over 2,000 Soviet aircraft on the very first day of the invasion alone. Soviet losses on the ground were catastrophic by any measure. By December 1941, the Red Army had suffered 4 million total casualties. 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were starving and dying in German camps. Generaloberst Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote confidently in his diary on July 3rd that the campaign had essentially been won in 14 days. The Red Army, he believed, was broken beyond any hope of recovery. He was wrong. What Halder did not grasp, what no German planner had adequately prepared for, was the sheer depth of Soviet reserves. German intelligence had estimated 200 Soviet divisions before the invasion. By August, they had already counted 360. They destroyed a dozen, and a dozen more appeared in their place. Every encirclement that looked like the final blow turned out to be the beginning of something worse. The Red Army was absorbing losses that would have shattered any European army in history. It absorbed them and kept fighting. By late July, Germany was winning every battle and losing the campaign. The contradiction was invisible from Berlin. On the ground in Russia, it was unmistakable. The panzer divisions were bleeding tanks faster than factories at home could replace them. Guderian's formations operated at roughly half their assigned tank strength. Not from combat losses, from mechanical breakdowns. From roads that did not exist on German maps because they did not exist in reality. From fuel consumption that doubled and then tripled with every week of the advance into the Russian interior. A panzer regiment needed 60,000 liters of fuel per day under normal operating conditions. On Russian roads, unpaved, rutted, and often no more than dirt tracks through swamp and forest, that figure climbed to 120,000 liters. Sometimes 180,000. The panzers had advanced 320 kilometers in the first 5 days of the campaign. By early July, the daily rate of advance collapsed to 20 kilometers. The 8th Panzer Division went from 75 kilometers a day in the first week to 32 by mid-July. Speed was the entire foundation of blitzkrieg. Without speed, the Germans were just a very large army a very long way from home. The infantry was supposed to follow the tanks and consolidate the ground they seized. It could not keep pace. Most German soldiers walked into Russia on foot, carrying their equipment on their backs. Their boots wore through within weeks on roads that turned to choking dust in the heat and impassable rivers of mud in the rain. Their supply wagons were pulled by horses, 600,000 of them at the start of the campaign. Those horses needed 53 tons of feed per division per day. In one summer month alone, the Wehrmacht seized 112 tons of oats and 768 tons of hay from Russian collective farms. Starving German soldiers were court-martialed for eating the horse feed. Hungry horses gnawed on wooden fence posts and tree trunks and anything else they could reach. Their cotton feed bags rotted in the damp of the Russian autumn. The entire front required the equivalent of 120 trainloads of supplies per day, just for normal operations. Not for launching offensives, simply to keep the army alive and functioning. Only about 100 trainloads arrived on a good day. Russian partisans sabotaged the rail lines nightly, blowing up tracks and bridges behind the German advance. The gauge of Russian railways was wider than European standards. Every single kilometre of track had to be physically converted before German trains could use it. The conversion teams could not keep up with the speed of the advance. The logistics system was collapsing one failed delivery at a time. Karl Fuchs watched it happen from inside his panzer. His unit raced ahead of the marching infantry columns. The fuel trucks fell behind by days, then by weeks. Then the spare parts stopped coming entirely. Then the ammunition ran short. The war became something no one in that crew had been trained for: a war of survival, not conquest. August 11th, 1941, Franz Halder sat at his desk in the field headquarters and reconsidered everything he had written 5 weeks before. On July 3rd, he had declared the campaign essentially won. Now he wrote something very different. We have underestimated the Russian colossus. He continued writing in his precise shorthand. At the outset of the war, they had reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now they had already counted 360. The new divisions were not armed or equipped to German standards, he noted. Their tactical leadership was often poor, but they were there. And when Germany smashed a dozen of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen. This was the moment the math stopped working. Not the tactics, not the courage, not the will, the math. Germany was destroying Soviet armies at a rate no military force in recorded history had ever matched. And it was not enough. The question had shifted beneath the entire German war effort without anyone formally acknowledging it. 5 weeks ago, the question was, can we win fast enough? Now the question was, can we win at all? Hitler did not ask that question. He turned south instead, toward Kiev, toward the biggest encirclement battle in military history, and toward a decision that would cost him Moscow, and with it, any remaining chance of ending the war in 1941. That choice, and what it revealed about the nature of this war, would define everything that followed. September 1941. The Battle of Kiev. On paper, the greatest German victory of the entire war. Over 660,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in a single operation, 4 entire field armies destroyed. 43 divisions were swallowed in one massive encirclement. The German press celebrated for days. Hitler called it the greatest battle in the history of the world. The generals who actually fought it knew better. The victory was hollow. Kiev had consumed precious weeks that could never be recovered. Weeks that should have been spent driving toward Moscow while the weather still allowed it. Guderian had argued fiercely against the southern diversion. He wanted Moscow before the autumn rains turned the roads to swamp. Hitler overruled him. The panzers swung south, won their spectacular encirclement, and turned north again, exhausted, depleted, and running out of time. By the time the armored spearheads reoriented toward the Soviet capital, October had arrived. And with it came the rain. The Rasputitsa. Russia's infamous autumn mud season. The roads dissolved into swamps overnight. Tanks sank to their hulls in black muck that swallowed everything. Trucks drowned up to their axles and had to be abandoned. Horses died in mud that reached their bellies. The entire German advance ground to a complete halt. Not because of the enemy, because of the earth itself. But behind the German lines, something else was happening that autumn, something the Wehrmacht had never anticipated and could not have prevented. Something that would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire war. 1,500 factories were being ripped from their foundations, piece by piece, loaded onto rail cars, and shipped 1,000 miles east into the heart of Russia, while German soldiers froze on the road to Moscow. Soviet workers were stealing a future. Their own. The Western territories that Germany had captured held an enormous share of Soviet industrial power. 85% of Soviet aircraft production sat in those occupied regions. 9 of the country's tank factories. 70% of its coal mines. 50% of its steel and aluminum production capacity. 40% of its electric power generation. Losing all of that industrial capacity should have ended the Soviet war effort within months. It did not. Between July and November 1941, the Soviet government ordered the emergency relocation of 1,523 major industrial enterprises. 667 went to the Urals, 224 to Western Siberia, 308 to Central Asia and Kazakhstan. An estimated 10 million workers moved with the machines. They traveled east in open freight cars through the first bitter snows of winter, with their families crammed in beside them. with lathes and stamping presses and engine blocks strapped to flatbeds in the same train. Nearly 300 factories never arrived at their intended destinations, lost in the chaos of transit, stolen, or recaptured by the advancing Germans. But the ones that arrived changed the course of the war. At Chelyabinsk in the Ural Mountains, workers were given 75 days to rebuild an entire steel works from nothing but frozen earth. They did it in 56, starting with ground so hard it had to be dynamited before foundation posts could be sunk. Living in canvas tents while temperatures dropped to -40 degrees, working around the clock in shifts that never stopped, day or night. The Kirov tank works from Leningrad, one of the most critical armor production plants in the Soviet Union, was dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto eastbound trains, and reassembled deep in the Urals. The first T-34 medium tank from the relocated plant rolled off the new production line in December 1941, 3 months after the evacuation order was given. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any narrative. In 1941, the Soviet Union built 6,274 tanks. In 1942, they built 24,639. Tank production nearly quadrupled in 12 months. Military production in the Urals increased 180% over the same period. In the Volga region, it rose 200%. In Western Siberia, 140%. By 1942, 4.4 million industrial workers had been trained or retrained for wartime manufacturing. The percentage of women operating forging and press machines rose from 11% in 1941 to 50% by the end of 1942. Germany had captured the territory. The Soviets had taken the machines. The machines were all that mattered. Karl Fuchs and his 9 remaining tanks knew nothing about Chelyabinsk. They did not know that every T-34 they destroyed would be replaced by 4 more rolling off production lines they could not reach and could not bomb. They knew only that the cold was killing their engines faster than the Russians were killing their crew, and that no replacement tanks were coming from the west. October 2nd, 1941. Operation Typhoon. The final drive to Moscow. Hitler ordered everything thrown at the Soviet capital. Every available panzer division was concentrated under Army Group Center. Every bomber the Luftwaffe could spare was redirected to the central sector of the front. Every last reserve he possessed, which was almost nothing, was committed to the assault. The initial results stunned even the attackers. At Vyazma and Bryansk, the Wehrmacht encircled and trapped over 600,000 more Soviet soldiers in twin pockets. The road to Moscow appeared open. For exactly 2 weeks. Then the rain came. Russia's autumn mud stopped the entire offensive cold. For 3 weeks, armored columns sat motionless on roads that had ceased to exist. The ground was too soft for tank tracks, too deep for any wheeled vehicle. Men carried ammunition and rations forward on their backs because nothing mechanical could move through the muck. In those 3 desperate weeks, the Soviets did something extraordinary. Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed commander of Moscow's defense, assembled 9 reserve armies behind the Volga River. Roughly 900,000 fresh troops, many of them transferred from Siberia and the Soviet Far East. Stalin had received intelligence from the German-born spy Richard Sorge operating in Tokyo that Japan intended to strike south toward the Pacific and Southeast Asia, not north toward the Soviet border. That single piece of intelligence freed the Siberian garrison divisions for redeployment. 75 fresh, winter-hardened divisions arrived outside Moscow. They arrived with warm uniforms, white camouflage smocks, and weapons designed and lubricated to function in extreme cold. The Germans had none of those things. November 1941. The ground freezes. The panzers can move again. The temperature drops to -30 degrees. German soldiers stuff their thin overcoats with newspaper, with straw. It is not enough. 100,000 cases of frostbite are reported across Army Group Center. 15,000 limbs are amputated in field hospitals that are themselves freezing. Tank engines will not start in the mornings because the lubricants have frozen solid inside the engine block. Weapons jam. Machine gun oil turns to paste and the firing mechanism seize. Optical gun sights fog over with condensation and become useless. bread must be cut with a saw. German forward units pushed to within 15 miles of Moscow. Soldiers claim they can see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They are closer to the Soviet capital than any foreign invader will ever be again. But they have nothing left. The 11th Panzer Regiment does not have a single operational tank. Panzer crews are fighting as infantry with rifles and grenades in the snow. On November 28, a conference of senior German industrialists chaired by Armaments Minister Fritz Todt reached a devastating conclusion. The war against Russia is no longer winnable through military means. Having failed to achieve a quick victory in the summer, Germany simply lacks the resources and industrial capacity to prevail in a sustained war of attrition. The next day, November 29, Todt meets with Hitler personally. Walter Roland, the head of German tank production, accompanies him. Roland argues that once the United States enters the conflict as a belligerent, which is now clearly only a matter of time, it will be mathematically impossible to match the combined Allied industrial output. Todt tells Hitler what no general has been willing to say aloud. This war can no longer be won by military means. Hitler asks a question that will echo through the remaining years of the conflict. How shall I end this war? Todt answers only a political solution is possible. Hitler dismisses him. There will be no political solution. There will be no negotiated peace. There will be no retreat. There will be 4 more years of dying. Todt will be dead within 3 months, killed in a plane crash at the Wolf's Lair headquarters on February 8, 1942, under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. The question he raised will outlive him by 3.5 years. On December 5, 1941, Georgy Zhukov launched his counteroffensive. 56 reinforced Soviet divisions crash into the frozen, exhausted German lines along the entire Moscow front. Fresh Siberian troops in white winter camouflage assault an army that has not received a single-issue winter coat. The Wehrmacht is pushed back between 100 and 250 kilometers from Moscow in the weeks that follow. Klin was liberated on December 15. The encirclement of Tula is broken. The 4th Panzer Army reports that over just 2 days of retreat in December the 18th and 19th, 2 of its corps abandoned 155 howitzers, 40 anti-tank guns, and hundreds of mortars and machine guns in the snow. The equipment was left behind because there were no vehicles or surviving horses left to haul it. Army Group Center suffered 352,000 casualties between December and April. It is Hitler's first defeat on land in the entire war. It will not be his last. Halder's diary from that November records something else that deserves close attention. Private remarks by Hitler himself that acknowledged the impossibility of achieving total military victory. From that point forward, every man responsible for Germany's war economy and industrial planning fulfilled his role in the clear knowledge that strategic success was unattainable. They kept working anyway, because no one in the Third Reich could afford to say it aloud. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht had suffered over 1 million casualties on the Eastern Front, nearly 200,000 dead, over 655,000 wounded, more than 40,000 are missing. Compare that to France. The entire Western campaign of 1940, the conquest of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in just 6 weeks, cost 156,000 total casualties, 30,000 dead. Russia consumed 6 times that number in 6 months. The Luftwaffe lost 2,505 aircraft by the end of December. The Army lost 2,735 tanks as total write-offs. 104 assault guns were destroyed beyond repair. Nearly 20% of all tank losses came in the final desperate weeks of the year alone, during the chaotic retreat from the gates of Moscow. The panzer divisions that had conquered all of Western Europe 6 months earlier were now shadows of their former strength. But the numbers alone do not explain why Germany never recovered. Other armies in history have absorbed catastrophic losses and rebuilt themselves. The numbers describe the wound. The wound had a deeper cause. Germany could not replace what it had lost. That is the answer to the question this entire war would continue to ask for 4 more years. Not the cold, not the mud, not Hitler's strategic interference, though all of those things mattered. The fundamental answer is that Germany entered a war it could not sustain. And every month it continued to fight, making the deficit wider and the odds longer. Every tank that broke down on a frozen Russian road was a tank that German factories struggled to replace. Every trained soldier who died in the snow was replaced by someone younger, less experienced, and less prepared for what awaited him at the front. There was no rotation system for exhausted frontline troops, no fresh divisions waiting in strategic reserve to relieve the ones that had been fighting without pause since June. No second wave, no industrial hinterland safely beyond the reach of enemy bombers or advancing armies. The Soviet Union had all of these things, and it was building more of them every single day in factory complexes the Germans could not reach and could not destroy. 5 structural fractures broke the German war machine after June 1941. None of them could be repaired. First, distance. The front was too vast for any army on Earth to hold and supply simultaneously. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers through a country with almost no paved roads. 80% of German logistics depended on horses pulling supply wagons, horses that starved and froze by the tens of thousands during that first Russian winter. Germany used 2.75 million horses over the entire course of the war. It could never breed or purchase them fast enough to replace the ones that died in the east. Second, oil. Germany depended on Romanian crude from the Ploiești fields for over half its total fuel imports. At peak output in 1941, those fields produced nearly 6 million tons of oil per year, but only 3 to 4 million tons actually reached German refineries, due to transport bottlenecks and competing demands from other Axis nations. Every mile the Wehrmacht drove east burned fuel that could not be replaced from existing sources. The Caucasian oil fields, the one strategic prize that could have sustained the German war machine, remained permanently beyond the army's operational reach. Third, manpower. The Wehrmacht had no rotation system for its combat divisions, no fresh formations held in strategic reserve behind the front. The men who crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd were the same men expected to storm Moscow in December. 6 months of continuous, grinding combat with no relief, no rest, and no significant replacements. By contrast, the Soviets mobilized reserve armies totaling over 4 million fresh soldiers by the end of the year. Mongolia alone supplied over 500,000 horses to the Red Army between 1941 and 1945. The Soviet manpower pool, drawing on a population of 170 million people spread across 11 time zones, seemed bottomless to the German commanders trying desperately to exhaust it. Fourth, intelligence. German military planners estimated 200 Soviet divisions before the invasion began. The real number exceeded 360 by August, and the Soviets kept raising more throughout the autumn and winter. Every time the Wehrmacht destroyed a Soviet army, a new one appeared in its place within weeks. The intelligence failure was not a simple error in counting. It was a structural blindness, a fundamental inability to grasp that the Soviet state could absorb military losses on this unprecedented scale and continue to function as a fighting nation. Fifth, production. While Germany struggled to manufacture approximately 3,000 tanks per year, the relocated Soviet factories would produce 24,000 in 1942 alone. The first T-34 from the new Ural assembly lines rolled out 3 months after the factory left Ukraine on a flatbed train. Soviet tank production nearly quadrupled between 1941 and 1942. The gap between German and Soviet industrial output was not a disadvantage that could be closed with better tactics or harder fighting or greater willpower. It was a death sentence written in steel. Franz Halder understood this by August 1941. Fritz Todt understood it by November. Hitler understood it too. His own private remarks confirm as much. He chose to keep fighting anyway. 3.5 more years. Millions more dead. On both sides of the front. Karl Fuchs never saw the spring. He was killed on November 21, 1941, near Tula. 14 days before Zhukov's counteroffensive began. He was 24 years old. His wife received his last letter 3 weeks after he died. In that letter, he did not write about victory. He did not write about the fatherland. He wrote about the cold. He was one of nearly 200,000 German soldiers killed on the Eastern Front in 1941. He was one of 5.6 million who would die there before the war finally ended. The Soviet Union lost over 26 million people in the same conflict. Soldiers, workers, families, children who never learned why the train stopped running. Germany invaded the Soviet Union believing it would take 8 weeks. It took 4 years. And they lost every one of them. The war was decided in the summer of 1941. Not by a single battle. Not by a single general. By a country too large to conquer, too industrial to exhaust, and too stubborn to fall. Somewhere on the road east of Moscow, a pair of black grease hands lies still in the frozen mud. They belonged to a mechanic who believed he was fixing a machine. He was. He just never saw the machine he was trapped inside. In the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, Germany suffered over 1 million casualties. The Wehrmacht never fully recovered. The Eastern Front consumed 80% of German military strength for the remainder of the war. Between June 1941 and May 1945, 5,006 million German soldiers died on the Eastern Front compared to 750,000 on all other fronts combined. If this reached you, if you felt the weight of what happened on that road, then this channel did what it was built to do. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand what June 1941 really cost. And leave a like, not for us, but so the algorithm carries this story to the people still looking for it.